We've been on a journey together throughout this series on royal courts, exploring how you construct them from the ground up, the distinct types of people you populate them with, the bizarre rituals that bind them together, and the cutthroat mechanisms used to control them. Now, we have finally arrived at our fifth and concluding episode. Today, we are going to dive into the biggest mistakes world builders make when designing a noble court, alongside the little odds and sods, those extra vivid textures of daily life that will make your fictional palace feel like a completely unique, living, breathing space. Welcome to the final episode of our Royal Court series, and another episode of Just-in-Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. Our very first topic of conversation today is the way that writers design the internal political factions that populate a palace. Far too often, I see world builders fall directly into the two-faction trap. They create a political landscape that basically amounts to good guys party versus bad guys party. It looks like a modern, first-past-the-post political environment, where you have a blue team and a red team and everyone just files neatly into two giant ideological tents. But a medieval or fantasy court does not work like a modern two-party democracy. Bear in mind that most nobles sit on top of their own independent provincial power base. Because of that, alliances between factions are fluid, ever-shifting, and constantly evolving based on immediate circumstances. They might cooperate because their personal relationships align, because they share a temporary or strategic goal, or simply because one lord happens to be married to another lord's sister. But the moment those underlying conditions change, the alliances change as well. It's also a massive mistake to assume that a court is divided into people who are completely on the king's side versus people who want to overthrow him. As a baseline rule of thumb, a reigning monarch generally commands sort of 50% support from the nobility. Otherwise, you aren't looking at court intrigue anymore. You're probably starting to look in the direction of active civil war. But having a lord support the monarch doesn't mean they agree with them automatically, and it doesn't mean the people opposing the crown are bad guys. Highborn lords will actively oppose a sovereign over a single specific policy decision, while remaining completely loyal to the institution of the crown itself. Look at history's greatest knight, William Marshal, the first Earl of Pembroke. Marshal detested King John, known as John Lackland. He thought John was a petulant, incompetent ruler, and John made countless atrocious decisions that actively harmed Marshal's interests. Yet, when the rest of the barons revolted, Marshal stuck by the king. Why? Because Marshal possessed an unyielding, rigid code of chivalric honor and believed in the supreme preservation of his class hierarchy. He supported the man holding the crown, despite hating the man himself. This psychological nuance is one of the reasons why Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire is so compelling, in my opinion. The courtly factions in Westeros are a constantly moving mosaic. House Tyrell of Highgarden doesn't just pick a team and stay there. They align with Renly Baratheon first, then switch to the Lannisters when Renly dies, and eventually shift their allegiance to the Targaryens. The Starks and the Lannisters might remain fixed ideological poles, but the rest of the realm shifts and sways as their long-term strategic interest dictates. We see another masterclass in faction design in Jacqueline Carey's Cashil's Dart. Early in the books, there's a high-stakes plot led by Lionette de Travaillon to overthrow her brother, the king, and put her son Bowden de Travaillon on the throne instead. Throughout the narrative, different lords at court align with Lionette's faction and then quietly pull away as the wind changes. For instance, Marquis Solan Balfour, the keeper of the Privy Seal, is initially aligned with a conspiracy, but as the plot thickens, She gets cold feet. She starts asking herself, is this plot actually going to succeed? Or am I going to end up holding the bag for failed treason? To protect herself, Solane sets up a steep price for her continued cooperation. She demands a written message from Lionette delivered physically by Bowden. Why? Because having that physical letter gives Solane blackmail leverage. If the coup fails, she has leverage to ensure Lionette works hard to protect Solane from backlash. The factions surrounding the Balfour house thus shifted their position away from the treasonous plot. And notice how Carey writes the conspirators. Bowden and Lionette are not portrayed as moustache-twirling villains or cruel tyrants out to ruin the countryside. They're just profoundly ambitious, hyper-capable aristocrats who genuinely believe they could do a better job ruling the kingdom than the current king. When you are building your own fictional courts, treat your factions with this level of respect. Abandon binary morality. Do not make it a war between pure good and pure evil within a court. Give every house a strategic goal. Think about exactly what these noble families want to achieve over the next 50 years for their lineage. And allow alliances to be fluid. Let economic shifts and failed plots naturally force old enemies into uncomfortable beds or shift alliances away. Long story short, give your factions separate motivations, strategic goals, and let them realign as the world changes around them. Speaking of motivation, I cannot tell you how often I see the politics in fantasy books fall completely flat, even when the book isn't strictly a political fantasy, but just a standard epic journey, because the political symbols are empty. They're hollow. They're flat. And why? Because instead of giving an internal court factions a real breathing motivation, the world builder has focused entirely on symbology. It's the kind of writing where you can tell the good guys from the bad guys simply because the loyalists wear a flat felt cap while the conspirators wear top hats. Now, don't get me wrong, I love me some symbology. I absolutely adore giving factions distinct visual symbols that they can wear, display, and flex with. That is an essential part of world design. In my own Sangville Chronicles, I used the mandatory noble sash to visually differentiate the aristocracy, turning a piece of silk into a vital part of the empire's socio-political language. In my world's religion, I work in symbology constantly, differentiating factions by whether they wear Soa charms or brotherhood necklaces or coarse seal belts. You 100% need symbology for your factions. But here is your golden rule. Symbology is an outgrowth of the faction's history and its goals. It does not take the place of motivation. Giving a political faction a funny hat just so the reader can distinguish them is the courtly equivalent of the classic sci-fi trope Planet of the Hats. Except instead of applying it to an alien race, you're applying it to a palace room. A symbol must be a shorthand for a deeply held belief, an economic reality, or a historical grievance. Without that underlying substance, it's an empty shell. Factions in a real court absolutely utilized iconography. We see it over and over again in our own history. In the English Civil War, the parliamentarian Roundheads purposefully cut their hair close to visually distance themselves from the long flowing ringlets of the royalist cavaliers. During the fall of the Merovingians, the ancient Merovingian kings, who considered their long uncut hair to be literal sacred source of their royal right to rule, were shaved. When Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was deposed by Pepin the Short, son of Charles the Hammer Martel, the Carolingians didn't just strip his title. Before locking him away in a monastery, they publicly shaved his head. They used a pair of shears to physically and symbolically execute his divine legitimacy. Heck, think of the Crusaders. The medieval knights who wore the Crusader cross stitched directly onto their surcoats as a literal badge of holy warfare. So, symbology, important. We see it wonderfully handled in modern fiction too. In Game of Thrones, We have the house devices and ancestral words. Hear me roar, winter is coming, we do not sow. But these are not cool marketing slogans. They are distilled summaries of each house's generational trauma, geography, and political ideology. In Cashil's Dart, the intricate heraldry isn't just limited to the highborn houses. It extends down to the houses of the night court, the specific flowers and motifs worn by the specialized courtesans represent a shared cultural philosophy regarding service, art, and divine desire. So symbols are important, do not get me wrong, but only when they represent something real. A symbol must be an organic outgrowth of a faction's ideology, strategy, and the real human characters who wear that symbol. Otherwise, you aren't actually writing a court, you're just hosting a costume party. Speaking of parties, there is another court building mistake that drives me batty. The assumption of perfect information. Far too often in fantasy books, news travels through the palace like a modern fiber optic network. A secret conversation happens in the dark corner of the gardens during the latest royal party, and by breakfast the next morning, the entire nobility somehow know the exact, unfiltered truth of what was said. Do these writers honestly think that rumors, the game of broken telephone, and malicious gossip were invented in the 20th century? In a real historical court, information was a muddy, distorted mess. People made up stories constantly. They slandered their rivals. They spread absurdly salacious rumors and actively engaged in malicious character assassination. And the more ridiculous and scandalous the rumor was, the faster it spread. Think about the contrast between our world and theirs. If I hear a shocking piece of news on the internet today, my baseline instinct is to fact check it. I look for at least 2 independent sources, preferably with different political leanings, to verify the core facts, and even then, I analyze the framing of those facts. We have an unprecedented global ability to verify data in real time. But in a medieval or fantasy court setting, you could tell a bald-faced lie, and the only way for someone to check its validity is to physically ask the person the lie was about. And what if that person isn't even at court? What if they're miles away on a military campaign? King Richard the Lionheart spent years locked away as a captive hostage in Germany, while his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, struggled to hold his kingdom together. You can bet your bottom dollar that the court back home was drowning in wild rumors spread by his brother John Lackland to undermine Richard's legitimacy. And this slander doesn't just stop when a person dies. It cements itself into history. Look at the historical reputation of King Richard III. Thanks to William Shakespeare, generations of theatregoers grew up believing Richard III was a literal monster, a moustache-twirling villain with a hunchback and evil dripping from his fangs, who murdered the princes in the tower out of pure, unadulterated malice. But modern historians will tell you that Richard III probably wasn't any more wicked than any other highborn noble of his era. Let's be real, practically all medieval aristocrats were hyper-ambitious power players who did pretty terrible things to ensure their family's survival. That was the job. But because his enemies won the war, the rumor and the slander became the permanent narrative. You can check out my video on propaganda in the info card. This distinction is vital for you to understand in world building. Feudal courts are not ideological. They are personal. These nobles aren't fighting over abstract policy papers or economic theories. They are fighting for themselves, their bloodlines, and their family properties. In an environment that deeply personal, gossip and rumors aren't just idle chatter to pass the time. They are weapons of war. If you can successfully ruin a rival lord's reputation, cast doubt on the legitimacy of his heir, or make the king suspect him of treason while he's away from the palace, you can destroy his house without having to draw a sword. So, strip your characters of their perfect information. Let them operate in the dark, let them make catastrophic decisions based on bad data, and let the vipers in your court weaponize the whisper network to its limits. Just before I tell you why policy does still matter, give me a moment to tell you about my latest fiction book, Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas. This is an urban fantasy book with a fast-paced mystery involving the fairy courts, a dastardly sorcerer, and a plot to change the way the world works. It won the Flash 500 award in 2025, and this is what the judges said about it right here. If that sounds interesting to you, check out the Kickstarter on the links below. Okay, back to the show. Now, just because I said that court politics are deeply personal rather than ideological, that does not mean that policy doesn't matter. I see this mistake all the time in fantasy as well. A world builder will create a faction of good guys who are noble, honorable, wonderfully sweet human beings, but they have absolutely shitty economic policy. They tax the snot out of the populace to fund some grand, noble, idealistic goal that doesn't actually do a damn thing to foster the physical well-being of the realm. Let me tell you what happens to those honorable good guys. They end up with a massive bloody peasant rebellion in short goddamn order. Your fantasy king can be the sweetest, kindest, most well-meaning boy to ever sit his ass on the throne. But if his actual application of policy fails to encourage trade, secure peace, protect the economy of his kingdom, he will face an uprising. Ideology might not be what the aristocratic vipers are actively fighting over in the palace corridors, but the real-world consequences of their policy remain relevant. And conversely, look at your bad guys. If your antagonists are hyper-competent administrators who pass excellent agricultural policies, keep trade routes completely safe from bandits, and ensure their peasants stay fat, healthy, and economically stable, the fact that they are ruthless, terrible human beings in their private lives is not going to matter to those peasants, not even a little. Remember, history from a peasant's perspective is this. As far as the working class is concerned, the entire nobility sucks. They all systemically extract wealth from labor. They are all part of an oppressive dominance hierarchy. So to a peasant, the abstract morality or honor of a lord is kind of, sure, okay, honor and all that. The question that matters is, how bad is my daily life under this specific person's rule? How much tax do I need to pay? And am I free to marry my daughters to people? If they are constantly overtaxed, if they are constantly oppressed, it doesn't matter how poetically beautiful the Lord is. If a ruthless usurper takes over and lowers taxes and gives free access to the mill to the peasants, those peasants are going to stand behind that bad guy in a solid, unyielding front. This dynamic is especially critical to remember because the feudal system is, say it with me now, a deeply decentralized environment. And because of that, every individual lord gets to set the immediate micro policies within their private lands. The king might set the wider macro policies for the kingdom, but he has very few resources to actually implement them on his own. He is dependent on his independent vassals to enforce royal law within their own boundaries. So when you are designing your fictional courts, look past the personal morality of your characters and analyze the material reality of their governance. If your good guys have terrible policy, give them an angry mob. If your bad guys look after their people, give them a fiercely loyal provincial power base. Just because the politics of the court are personal doesn't mean the policies don't have consequences. Now, while we've established that the nobility will fiercely protect their caste barrier, you cannot treat your lower classes as a passive, invisible monolith. The lower classes do have a shaping impact on the royal court. When things get bad enough, peasants will act. You had massive coordinated uprisings like Wat Tyler's Rebellion in 14th century England, where an army of labourers marched right into London, shook up the royal establishment, and forced the young King Richard II to personally negotiate with them on the field. But outside of open, violent revolutions, there is also a more subtle, insidious pressure creeping up from below all throughout the medieval period, and that is the rising merchant class. As trade routes expand and urban centres grow, wealthy merchants and guild masters start accumulating obscene amounts of liquid wealth, and once a merchant gets rich enough, they inevitably want to do one thing. They want to break into the nobility. Now, getting a king to hand you a brand new hereditary title out of thin air is really hard and politically fraught. But bypassing the king and marrying into a title, that's a whole different story. Aristocratic noble houses did sometimes, and sometimes frequently, fall into disastrous financial ruin. They were title rich but cash poor, buried under a mountain of debt from funding private wars, paying off royal progress fees, or trying to maintain an extravagant lifestyle at court. When a noble house hit rock bottom, marrying the heir off to a wealthy merchant's daughter was a great way to eject some very needed fresh cash into the family coffers through the daughter's dowry. But this economic survival tactic does come at a social cost. It tanked the prestigious status of that house. The moment the proud ancient lineage brought new money into the family, the rest of the hyper-competitive court would close in like little sharks. There would be gossip behind fans, snickers in the hallways, and they would treat the family like a bunch of desperate money-grubbing tradesmen. So in your world, where your right to rule is built on the illusion of a divine, unblemished blood, marrying a merchant was very much a compromise. Playing with this dynamic is a great source of drama for world builders. It introduces a source of internal friction, political intrigue, and narrative flavor that will make your court feel incredibly rich. So while you absolutely must keep your nobility fiercely protective over their status, never forget that the walls of the palace are under constant pressure. Peasants will revolt when pushed to the brink. Merchants will use their gold to chip away at the elite class barrier from the inside out. Now, I know, I spent the first segment warning you to be wary of hollow iconography, but the exact opposite mistake is just as dangerous. If you construct your palace using nothing but standard generic fantasy tropes, like a basic herald shouting names at a door, a throne room with a red carpet, and a standard feast, your setting completely blends together with a forgettable piece of historical stock art. To make your court unforgettable, you need to design unique, localized rituals. These rituals shouldn't just be random background dressing. They should actively serve as a language for the court's internal politics. Let's look back at Jacqueline Carey's Cashil's Dart series. In the kingdom of Ter d'Ange, they celebrate a massive masked ball on the longest night of the year, the winter solstice in December. During this festival, the entire court wears masks and they perform a sacred traditional ritual play celebrating the rebirth of the Sun Prince. When Bowden de Trevelyan was launching his quest to usurp the throne, he volunteered to play the role of Sun Prince in the solstice performance. Well, actually I think Melisande volunteered him rather than him volunteering himself, but same diff. He played the role of the Sun Prince is the point. By donning that specific costume, he sent a public signal to the rest of the vipers at court. I am ready to become king, even if I'm not the direct heir. Books later, a young queen's heir does the exact same thing. Sidonie steps onto the floor in a costume directly reminiscent of that same Sun Prince play, using the court's shared theatrical language to signal that despite being a woman, she is ready to defend her birthright and absolutely no one is going to usurp her. That is the power of a culturally embedded ritual. It gives your characters a completely unique stage to play their political games on. And don't overlook those intimate high access rituals we discussed earlier, like Louis XIV's lever and cowsher, where the dukes fought each other just for the right to hold onto a candle or a shirt. I recently built a court for my own epic fantasy work, the court of Port Lango in the continent of Kisangani. In this setting, the reigning monarch, known as the Malina, never speaks directly to the assembled court. Instead, the Malina communicates entirely through a designated official known as the Voice. To make this ritual visually and culturally striking, the Voice wears an intricate veil made of heavy ivory beads, completely covering their mouth. When the voice is silent, the veil remains closed, masking their mouth. But the second they speak on the Malina's official's word, they draw those ivory beads back. This is a functional status flare and an organic outgrowth of how the Kisangani culture operates. It is designed to structurally protect the sovereign from the vulnerability of direct speech, elevating the crown's mystique. At the same time, it tells the audience a story about the material reality of the region. Port Lango is a wealthy trade port that actively exports exotic ivory from its native wildlife. Doing something like that, like swapping out a generic medieval Herod for a bead-veiled voice, tears your world away from historical stock art. It gives your world a unique cultural flavor. So when you're designing your palaces, give them distinct ceremonies. Think about what they eat, what they wear, how they hide their faces, and how they display their power. Unique rituals are the exact tool that will distinguish your fictional court from a generic history textbook. And now, while the amazing names of the members of this channel scroll past, let me tell you about one final bonus mistake. Now, I haven't spoken about royal guards much during this specific episode or this series, and the reason for that is simple. I have already done a whole dedicated deep dive video into the mechanics of royal guards, which you can check out in the information card. But one of the single biggest mistakes I see people make when they do write royal guards is making those guards loyal to the point of ridiculousness. Writers forget that the members of a royal guard are also human beings, and quite often they are drawn directly from the ranks of the nobility itself, meaning they are just as prone to ambition and personal grudges as any other court viper. If a king treats his royal guard poorly, chances are exceptionally high that he is going to end up with a sword in his back at some point. Look at what happened to King Ares II in A Song of Ice and Fire. The moment the Mad King decided he wanted to burn King's Landing to the ground, Jaime Lannister looked at his sworn oath, looked at the reality of the situation, and said, "Yeah, no, I'm not going to let you burn the city." And he put a sword straight through his sovereign. Or look at the real-world history of the Praetorian Guard under the emperors of Rome. Sure, the Praetorians looked after the emperor 100%. Right up until the exact moment, they didn't. There was a famously chaotic period in Roman history where the Praetorian Guard literally put the entire throne of the Roman Empire up for an auction to the highest bidder. And just as bad is a monarch who treats the royal guard like shit and yet suffers no consequences. In a society whose baseline legitimacy is built on the monopoly of violence, how on earth do you justify treating the elite soldiers who stand directly behind your back like absolute garbage? Treating your protectors badly is just a loud, clear invitation for disaster. Even if they don't explicitly assassinate you themselves, they might just conveniently choose to step aside, look the other way, and let a different assassin slip right through into your chambers. When you are designing your royal guards, think deeply about what motivates them, how well or how poorly the monarch treats them, and exactly what impact that dynamic has on your courtly politics. And that officially concludes our series on royal courts. There is going to be a definitive guide compilation coming down the pipeline pretty soon, which will stitch all of these parts together alongside a few other relevant episodes, like that Royal Guard video I mentioned, into an hours-long video. Keep an eye out for that if you want to experience the whole courtly architecture as one long epic masterclass. If you have made it this far into the palace depths with me, leave me a crown emoji in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, check out my video on the biggest mistakes people make with rebellions next. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another episode.